What if the Cleveland Browns didn't just mismanage a quarterback, but completely lost control of the story around him? Because right now, something feels off in Cleveland. The narratives are shifting, the tone has changed, and the same people who once questioned Shedeur Sanders are suddenly rushing to explain why his success makes perfect sense. That kind of switch doesn't happen unless pressure is building behind the scenes. For months, fans were told Shedeur wasn't ready, that he needed time, that decisions were being made strictly on football reasons. But the moment he stepped onto the field and started delivering, those explanations began to unravel. And now, reports and media discussions are hinting at something much deeper. Internal tension, quiet finger-pointing, and a growing belief that someone may be taking the fall. At the center of it all is head coach Kevin Stefanski. Once praised as a steady hand, he's now being pulled into a storm of speculation. Some reports claim he may want out. Others suggest his authority was never as strong as fans believed. And as Shedeur continues to prove he belongs, the spotlight isn't just on the quarterback anymore. It's on everyone who delayed him. This isn't just a story about wins and losses. It's about control, credibility, and what happens when undeniable talent forces the truth into the open. Because when a player succeeds faster than the narrative allows, somebody always gets uncomfortable. And what happened next is exactly why Cleveland feels like it's on the verge of another shakeup. Here's where things start to get uncomfortable for Cleveland, because the story they told fans for months doesn't line up with what's happening now. From the very beginning, the message was simple and repeated everywhere. Shedeur Sanders needed time. He was developing. He wasn't ready yet. Every delay was framed as patience. ... Not hesitation. Every decision was labeled a football decision, as if that phrase alone made it unquestionable. But once Shedeur finally stepped on the field, that carefully built narrative began to fall apart almost immediately. Because he didn't look overwhelmed. He didn't look lost. He didn't look like a project. He looked prepared, calm in the pocket, decisive with the ball, and confident in moments where young quarterbacks usually unravel. And that's when the tone around him shifted, quietly at first. Then, all at once, suddenly, the conversation wasn't about whether Shedeur could play. It was about why he hadn't been playing sooner. And when that question starts circulating, it forces an even bigger one into the open. Who made that call? This is where reports and media chatter begin pointing toward Kevin Stefanski. Not in a loud, official way, but in the kind of vague, layered language that usually signals internal tension. Phrases like hands tied, organizational decisions, and above his pay grade started popping up. And according to reports, that tension may have grown so strong that Stefanski himself could be ready to walk away. Now, to be clear, none of this has been officially confirmed. These are reports, conversations, and speculation coming from people close to the situation. But when multiple voices start echoing the same idea, that someone is being positioned as the fall guy, it's hard to ignore. What makes it more complicated is that Stefanski isn't some expendable coach. He's a two-time Coach of the Year. That kind of resume doesn't just disappear overnight unless something deeper is happening. And if Shedeur's success is now making past decisions look bad, that success becomes a problem for someone, not a celebration. And that's the uncomfortable truth emerging here. Shedeur playing well didn't just change games, it changed accountability. Because when talent forces the truth into the open, excuses stop working. But the real shock isn't just who might be blamed. It's who may have never had full control in the first place. This is where the story takes a turn. Because once you stop looking at the surface, the power structure in Cleveland starts to look very different. For a long time, fans assumed Kevin Stefanski was the final voice on football decisions. Head coach, play caller, two-time Coach of the Year. the guy in charge, but recent reports and media discussions suggest that picture may have been incomplete. Because if Stefanski truly believed Shedeur Sanders gave the Browns the best chance to win, then the obvious question becomes, why did it take so long for him to see the field? According to reports and speculation circulating around the league, Stefanski may not have had the level of control people assumed. There's been growing talk that roster decisions, especially at quarterback, weren't entirely his call. Some insiders have hinted that draft position, front office priorities, and long-term optics played a bigger role than pure performance. And if that's true, it would explain a lot. It would explain why a quarterback who reportedly performed well in camp and preseason still found himself waiting. It would explain the strange hesitation, the mixed messaging, and the constant need to justify decisions that didn't match what fans were seeing. And it would explain why, now that Shedeur is producing on the field, the narrative suddenly feels defensive. Because once Shedeur started delivering, the spotlight shifted upward. The conversation moved from, is he ready? To, why wasn't he trusted? And that's when the idea of someone being handcuffed started gaining traction. Some reports claim Stefanski was operating under constraints. Others suggest he was absorbing criticism for choices made above him. None of this is confirmed, but the consistency of the whispers is hard to ignore. What adds fuel to the fire is the way media coverage has changed. Certain voices that were once skeptical now sound careful. Explanations are getting longer. Language is getting softer. And there's a noticeable effort to reframe the past as development rather than delay. That usually happens when accountability is shifting behind the scenes. And here's the uncomfortable part. If Stefanski didn't have full control, then his reputation is taking hits for decisions he may not have fully owned. That creates frustration, it creates resentment, and in some cases, it creates an exit plan. Reports suggesting he may want out suddenly make more sense in that context. Not as an emotional reaction, but as a professional calculation. Because no coach wants to stay in a situation where success exposes internal conflict instead of fixing it. But that still leaves one question unanswered. If Stefanski wasn't fully in control, then who was? And what happens if that truth becomes impossible to hide? Here's where things start to feel uncomfortable. Because almost overnight, the tone around Shedeur Sanders changed, and not subtly. Analysts who once questioned his readiness suddenly sounded impressed. Media figures who focused on what he couldn't do began highlighting how fast he was learning. And reporters who previously leaned into skepticism started emphasizing development, patience, and the process. That kind of pivot doesn't happen without a reason. When Shedeur was sitting, the dominant storyline was that he needed time, that the NFL was a different beast, and that rushing him would be risky. Reports framed his confidence as swagger, his preparation as unconventional, and his presence as something the league needed to figure out. But once he got on the field and started producing, those same talking points didn't hold up anymore. So, the narrative had to evolve. Now, reports claim he was always respected behind the scenes. Now, we're hearing about extra film sessions, long hours in the office, and how quickly he climbed the learning curve. And to be clear, those things might be true, but the timing is what raises eyebrows. Because none of that seemed to matter publicly until it became impossible to ignore his performance. This is where speculation really starts to swirl. Some fans believe the media is protecting relationships. Others think certain reporters are trying to preserve access. And there's a growing belief online that early criticism wasn't about football as much as it was about comfort. Shedeur didn't fit the usual mold. He came in confident. He came in with a famous last name. And he didn't pretend to be grateful just to exist in the building. That made people uneasy. So when he succeeded, the coverage shifted from questioning his ability to explaining why he was able to succeed in a way that conveniently redirected credit. Suddenly, development became the headline. Suddenly, the system worked. Suddenly, the delay was necessary. But fans noticed the contradiction. Because if he was improving lightning fast, as some reports claim, then why was the opportunity delayed in the first place? And if the coaching staff always believed in him, why did it take public pressure and on-field results to reflect that belief? Those questions don't have clear answers. And that's why this story keeps growing. Because when narratives change this quickly, it usually means someone is trying to get ahead of the truth, not catch up to it. And once fans start comparing old clips to new commentary, the credibility gap becomes hard to ignore. The biggest problem isn't that minds changed, it's how they changed. And the longer that inconsistency sits in the spotlight, the harder it becomes to explain away. Which leads to an even bigger issue. What happens next if Shedeur keeps proving them wrong? This is where the conversation takes a sharp turn. Because once Shedeur Sanders started delivering on the field, the focus quietly shifted away from the quarterback and straight toward the head coach. Suddenly, Kevin Stefanski isn't just a coach navigating a difficult season. He's a man caught between competing narratives. On one side, reports suggest he helped develop Shedeur behind the scenes, spending extra time in meetings and breaking down film. On the other, rumors claim his hands may have been tied from the start, that key decisions weren't fully his to make, and that he's now absorbing blame for a situation that spiraled beyond his control. And that's where things get complicated. Around the league, there's been growing chatter that Stefanski may be frustrated. Not publicly, but quietly, according to speculation circulating online. He's tired of decisions being questioned after the fact. Tired of winning arguments only once the results make everyone uncomfortable. And tired of operating in an environment where football decisions don't feel final. None of this has been confirmed, and it's important to say that clearly. But the pattern feels familiar. When coaches don't have full control, they often become the easiest target when narratives break the wrong way. Wins get credited to players. Losses get pinned on the staff. And once a quarterback succeeds without the original plan, the story naturally looks for someone to blame. Some believe Stefanski delayed Shedeur intentionally. Others believe he wanted to start him sooner but couldn't. And then there's a third group that thinks the real issue has nothing to do with Stefanski at all. That he's simply the most visible name in a much larger organizational puzzle. What adds fuel to the fire is the sudden shift in how insiders talk about him. One week, he's a respected coach of the year. The next, his future feels uncertain. That whiplash doesn't happen unless conversations are happening behind closed doors. And if Stefanski truly feels boxed in, the idea of wanting out doesn't sound so far-fetched. Not because he failed, but because he may not want to keep standing in front of decisions he didn't fully own. That's the uncomfortable part no one wants to say out loud. Because if Shedeur keeps winning, the question won't be whether Stefanski made the wrong call. It'll be who really made the call in the first place. And once that question becomes unavoidable, the fallout could extend far beyond the sideline. Once Shedeur Sanders started stacking real performances, something subtle but unmistakable happened. The tone around him began to change. Not gradually, abruptly. Analysts who once questioned his readiness suddenly shifted into explanation mode. Reporters who emphasized what he couldn't do started highlighting how fast he was learning. And narratives that once painted him as not ready quietly morphed into stories about development, patience, and process. That shift didn't go unnoticed. According to online chatter, some fans believe this wasn't growth, it was damage control. The idea is simple. When the results no longer match the criticism, the story has to adapt. And in Cleveland's case, adaptation looked a lot like revision. Reports began surfacing about Shedeur being in the building early, about long film sessions, about extra work behind closed doors. Suddenly, the same behavior that was once framed as a concern was now being reframed as proof of commitment. And while none of that is inherently negative, the timing raised eyebrows. Because where was this emphasis before? That's where speculation creeps in. Some believe certain media voices are trying to soften earlier takes, knowing Shedeur isn't going anywhere. Others think relationships inside the organization may be influencing what gets emphasized and what quietly fades away. None of this has been confirmed, but the pattern feels familiar to anyone who's followed NFL media long enough. When a player proves harder to dismiss, the conversation often shifts from critique to context. From "he's not ready" to "here's why the process took time." It's not necessarily malicious, but it does raise questions about consistency. What complicates things further is that Shedeur himself hasn't fed into the noise. He hasn't gone on apology tours. He hasn't clapped back publicly. He's let the performances speak, and that silence has made the contrast even louder. Because while the coverage evolved, the receipts didn't disappear. Clips still exist, quotes still exist, and fans have long memories when it comes to players they feel were doubted unfairly. That's why some are now pushing back, calling out what they see as selective memory and convenient reframing. The uncomfortable truth is this: media narratives don't just report reality, they react to it. And when reality changes faster than expected, the reaction can look messy. Shedeur's rise forced that reckoning. And as his role solidifies, the bigger question isn't whether the coverage will stay positive, it's whether anyone will fully own how wrong the early reads might have been. Because if this was misjudgment instead of patience, that's a very different conversation. And that conversation might just be getting started. This is where the discussion gets uncomfortable. Because once Shedeur Sanders started winning games and commanding the offense, a word began floating around that nobody in the building has officially touched: sabotage. Now, to be clear, there is no confirmed evidence that anyone intentionally held Shedeur back. No leaked memo, no smoking gun. But what fans and analysts are reacting to is the sequence of events. And sequences matter in the NFL. First, Shedeur dominates practice reps according to reports. Then, he outperforms expectations when given real snaps. Then the explanation becomes, well, he needed more time. That's where the disconnect starts. Because when development timelines suddenly change after success, people naturally ask whether the original delay was about readiness or about risk. Some speculate that starting Shedeur too early could have exposed mistakes by people higher up the ladder. Others believe the organization simply misread how fast he could translate. And then there's a third theory gaining traction: that protecting jobs mattered more than accelerating a rookie. Again, these are rumors, not facts, but they didn't come out of nowhere. Fans point to how quickly the narrative flipped once the pressure shifted, once losses couldn't be pinned on inexperience, once the rookie became the bright spot instead of the unknown variable. At that point, the story wasn't about whether Shedeur was ready. It was about who delayed him and why. And that's where silence becomes loud. No one has directly addressed the gap between preseason evaluation and in-game results. No one has clearly explained why the quarterback with momentum wasn't prioritized sooner. Instead, the messaging has stayed vague, leaning on phrases like process and timing. Those words calm organizations, but they don't calm fan bases. What fuels suspicion even more is how quickly responsibility gets blurred. If Shedeur succeeds, it's framed as collective effort. If he struggles, it's framed as individual growth. That imbalance makes people uneasy, especially in a league where accountability is supposed to be everything. The truth may be far less dramatic than social media suggests. It could simply be hesitation, or miscalculation, or old school thinking colliding with a new school quarterback. But perception doesn't wait for confirmation. And right now, the perception among many fans is that Shedeur succeeded despite uncertainty, not because of clarity. That's why the sabotage conversation won't die, even without proof. Because once a player proves he belongs, every delay before that moment starts to feel suspicious in hindsight. And hindsight is ruthless. What's getting lost in all the noise is how dramatically this stretch has reshaped Shedeur Sanders' future, not just in Cleveland, but across the entire league. Because once a young quarterback proves he can handle NFL speed, command a locker room, and deliver under pressure, the conversation changes permanently. At that point, development is no longer theoretical, it's visible. And visibility is everything in this league. Before the breakout, Shedeur was treated like a question mark, a prospect with upside, a name tied to expectations, someone people felt comfortable debating instead of committing to. That's why the scrutiny felt endless. Every decision, every quote, every delay was magnified. But now the league has tape. And tape doesn't care about narratives. What's being discussed in front offices right now isn't whether Shedeur can play. It's how quickly everything clicked once he got real control. That's a dangerous realization for anyone who underestimated him. Because once a quarterback crosses that threshold, patience turns into pressure. Pressure to protect him, pressure to build around him, pressure to explain why it took so long. That's why this moment feels bigger than wins and losses. It's about leverage. Shedeur now has it. Every future decision, coaching, play calling, roster moves will be viewed through the lens of whether it helps or limits him. That's how franchise quarterbacks change organizations without saying a word. The building starts bending around them. And this is where speculation starts to bubble again. Some believe this is exactly why tensions feel high. When a rookie forces clarity too fast, it exposes indecision. It reveals who was confident and who was cautious. And in an NFL ecosystem built on hierarchy, that can be uncomfortable. What's also notable is how Shedeur has handled the moment. No victory laps, no public finger-pointing, no "I told you so," just steady answers and consistent play. That restraint matters more than people realize, because it removes the excuse to paint him as a distraction. And that's the irony. The same confidence once criticized is now being reframed as composure. The same presence once questioned is now being praised as leadership. Nothing about Shedeur changed, only the results did. And results are the one thing no narrative can argue with. The biggest shift of all is this. Going forward, Shedeur won't be evaluated as a project. He'll be evaluated as a standard. And standards don't wait. They force alignment or they force exits. That's why what comes next matters more than what already happened. Because now the organization has to decide whether it's ready to move at Shedeur's speed or get exposed trying to slow it down. And that decision might already be underway. At the center of all this noise, speculation, and finger-pointing is a simple reality that can't be spun away anymore. Shedeur Sanders has changed the direction of this entire conversation by force. Not with talk, not with branding, not with outside noise, with football. What makes this situation linger isn't whether mistakes were made. Mistakes happen in every NFL building. It's that once the answers arrived, the explanations felt late. Once the results were undeniable, the narratives became flexible. And once Shedeur proved he belonged, everyone suddenly wanted credit for the process. That's where fans lose trust. Because development is supposed to be linear, transparent, honest. But what unfolded here felt reactive. A series of adjustments made only after momentum became impossible to ignore. And whether that was hesitation, miscalculation, or something deeper, the result is the same. Questions that still don't have clean answers. What's undeniable is this. Shador didn't wait for permission. He didn't wait for alignment. He stepped into uncertainty and produced clarity. And that kind of player forces an organization to show its hand. You either build forward or you get exposed, standing still. That's why this moment matters beyond Cleveland. Around the league, people are watching how this plays out, how the messaging evolves, how accountability is handled, how quickly the system adapts now that the quarterback question isn't theoretical anymore. Because if the league teaches us anything, it's this. Franchises don't fail because they lack talent. They fail because they mismanage it. Shador Sanders is no longer a debate. He's no longer a projection. He's no longer a storyline waiting for confirmation. He is the confirmation. And from here on out, every delay, every decision, every shift in tone will be judged against one question only. Did it help the quarterback or protect someone else? That's the reckoning this moment creates. Not loud, not dramatic, just unavoidable. And as the season moves forward, the truth won't come from reports or speculation. It'll come from what happens next. Who stays, who moves, and who quietly disappears once the excuses run out. Because when a player like Shador arrives ahead of schedule, the organization has to catch up fast or get left behind.